Imagine this. It is the summer of 1876. General George Armstrong Custer leads over 200 soldiers into a valley along the Little Bighorn River in Montana. He is confident. He has done this before. The United States Army has the best rifles, the best logistics, the best command structure on the continent. And then, in less than an hour, every single man under his direct command is gone, not wounded, not retreating, gone. And the force that did it was not an army by any conventional definition. No uniforms, no artillery, no supply chains. Just warriors who had been defending their land for generations and who had decided that today, this valley was where they would draw the line. Here is the question that historians still argue about. How did a mounted tribal force defeat the most powerful military on the continent not once, but repeatedly? Over decades. Stay with me, because the answer is going to completely change how you think about the American frontier. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I am your host, Dustin, and today we are diving into the three Native American nations that made the United States Army genuinely afraid. Not cautious, not respectful, afraid. If you are new here, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because every week we go deeper into the stories that history class glossed over. Let us get into it. Before we talk about warriors and battles, you need to understand the world they were fighting to protect. Long before the first European boot touched the eastern coastline, the land we now call the United States was already home to an estimated 500 distinct tribal nations. Each one had its own language, its own governance, its own relationship with the land. Some stood alone. Others built vast political alliances, confederacies of power that stretched across hundreds of miles. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Sioux Alliance. These were not simple bands of hunter-gatherers. They were sophisticated political entities with diplomacy, law, and military tradition going back centuries. And yes, they fought each other too. Territorial disputes, competition over hunting grounds and trade routes, these were real and ongoing. But when a new force arrived, one that did not negotiate in good faith and did not stop, many of these nations found a common enemy, and three of them became legends. The first is the Lakota Sioux, and I want you to hold on to a question as we go through their story. There is a moment during the Ghost Dance movement of 1890 where the United States government makes a decision so brutal, so panicked, that it reveals exactly how terrified they truly were. We will get there. But first, you need to understand what made the Lakota so formidable. The word Lakota translates to friends or allies. The Sioux itself was a vast coalition. Three major branches: the Dakota, the Nakota, and the Lakota, also known as the Teton Sioux. The Lakota alone comprised 7 distinct bands, each with its own traditions and leadership, but capable of uniting into a single fighting force when the moment demanded it. Their home was the Great Plains, a vast ocean of grass, stretching from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains, and at its spiritual heart were the Black Hills of present-day South Dakota. The Lakota did not merely live there. They considered it sacred ground, the center of their world. Their spiritual life was not separate from their military identity. It was the engine of it. The Sundance, a grueling ritual of endurance and sacrifice, and the Vision Quest, a solitary journey of spiritual discovery. These were not ceremonies performed at a safe distance from real life. They were how Lakota warriors prepared themselves psychologically and spiritually for the reality of combat. An American soldier who could not understand why an enemy would charge into rifle fire without flinching was facing an opponent who had spent years training his mind to accept pain and face death without turning away. That is a tactical problem that no amount of better equipment can fully solve. Now here is where the story gets dark. The United States Army knew they could not defeat the Lakota purely on the battlefield. So they went after something else: the buffalo. Tens of millions of bison once thundered across the Great Plains. They were the foundation of Lakota life: food, shelter, clothing, tool material, spiritual symbolism. The Army did not just allow commercial hunters to destroy the herds. According to historical accounts, they actively encouraged and funded the slaughter as a deliberate strategic policy. Within a few decades, a population of roughly 30 million animals was reduced to near extinction. It was a siege weapon, not against a fort, against a way of life. But even that did not break the Lakota spirit, at least not immediately, because in 1876, they fought back in the most spectacular military fashion the frontier had ever witnessed. The Great Sioux War. The United States government had promised the Black Hills to the Lakota in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. Then, Gold was discovered there. And just like that, the treaty became inconvenient. The army was sent in to clear the way. What followed was a series of engagements that stunned the nation. At the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876, a combined force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led in part by the military genius of Crazy Horse, met Custer's 7th Cavalry and dismantled it completely. Over 260 American soldiers perished in under an hour. It remains one of the most decisive defeats ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of any opponent. And it was not their first. 8 years earlier, in what became known as Red Cloud's War, the Lakota and their allies had fought the army to a standstill in Wyoming and Montana. For 2 years, Red Cloud's warriors attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and made the Bozeman Trail militarily indefensible. The army built forts, the warriors burned them. In 1868, the United States signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie and abandoned every single fort it had constructed. It was the only war in American history where the U.S. government signed a peace treaty entirely on the enemy's terms. Red Cloud had won. So why, if the Lakota were winning militarily, did the government eventually prevail? That brings us back to the ghost dance, and the answer is more disturbing than most people realize. In the late 1880s, a Paiute spiritual leader named Wovoka began spreading a vision. He taught that through sacred dances and ritual, the earth would be renewed, the buffalo would return, and native peoples would be reunited with their ancestors. The movement spread rapidly across the plains. Lakota believers adapted it. Some wore special shirts they believed would protect them in battle. The ghost dance became a gathering force for a people who had suffered enormous loss. And the United States government panicked. Not because the dance was violent, it was not, but because it was unifying, because it was giving people hope. And a hopeful, unified people was something they could not afford. Officials declared the movement a threat, deployed additional troops, and in December of 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, what began as a disarmament operation ended in the massacre of over 250 Lakota men, women, and children. It was not a battle. It was a response to a prayer ceremony. And it tells you everything about how much the Lakota still made the American military apparatus afraid, even after years of forced relocation and resource deprivation. Key leaders shaped every chapter of that resistance. Red Cloud, the strategic mind who outnegotiated and outfought the army for years. Crazy Horse, the warrior who never signed a treaty and never stopped fighting. Sitting Bull, the spiritual and political leader who held his people together through impossible circumstances. These were not simply brave fighters. They were statesmen, generals, and visionaries, operating under conditions of total war. Now, do you think the United States would have resorted to destroying the buffalo herds if they believed they could defeat the Lakota Sioux in a fair fight? Let me know what you think in the comments below. The second nation on our list operated in some of the most brutal terrain on the continent and made it their greatest weapon, the Apache. Their name most likely derives from a Spanish phonetic rendering of the Zuni word for enemy, which is fitting, because by the time the United States Army was dealing with them in the latter half of the 1800s, the Apache had already been at war with Spanish colonizers and then Mexican forces for generations. They were not new to this. They had been refining their tactics against imperial powers for over 2 centuries before the first American soldier crossed into their territory. Before Spanish colonization, Apache territory covered a staggering expanse: eastern and central Arizona, southeastern Colorado, eastern and southwestern New Mexico, western Texas, and parts of northern Mexico. That range tells you something important. The Apache were not a people of a single environment. They were masters of the Chihuahuan Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the mountains of the Sierra Madre, the arroyos and canyons of the borderlands. Every inch of that landscape was a potential weapon in Apache hands. Here is the thing that made the Apache uniquely terrifying to conventional military forces. They did not fight like an army. They never intended to. Apache warfare was rooted in small unit raids, swift strikes against specific targets for specific purposes: horses, food, weapons, captives. A band of Apache warriors could appear out of nowhere, complete their objective, and vanish into terrain that pursuing soldiers could barely navigate on their best day. And then the soldiers would arrive at a mesa or a canyon they did not know, and discover that the Apache had been watching them the whole time. Their knowledge of the land was not just geographical, it was tactical. Every ridge, every water source, Every shadow at different times of day was part of their mental map of the battlefield. They could ambush from positions that offered no visible approach. They could break contact so completely that professional trackers lost them entirely. One Army officer famously remarked that chasing Apaches was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. Their leaders were singular. Cochise, chief of the Chiricahua Apache, spent over a decade in open conflict with the United States after a catastrophic misunderstanding in 1861, known as the Bascom Affair. An American lieutenant accused Cochise's band of abducting a boy named Felix Ward, a claim Cochise honestly denied and offered to help investigate. Instead of accepting the offer, the lieutenant had Cochise and several companions seized. Cochise escaped, but the episode spiraled into hostage-taking, executions on both sides, and the launch of the Apache Wars. A crisis that began with a refusal to take an honest man at his word cost the United States decades of conflict and tens of thousands of lives. And then there was Geronimo. His name became synonymous with Apache resistance, to the point where American paratroopers in the 20th century would shout it when jumping from planes. His ability to evade the United States Army, sometimes with just a handful of followers, for months at a time, across hundreds of miles of brutal desert terrain, was considered almost supernatural by the soldiers hunting him. At one point, the Army deployed over 5,000 soldiers, roughly 1/4 of its entire active force, to capture a group of fewer than 40 Apache men, women, and children. They finally surrendered in 1886, but only on specific terms, and only to General Nelson Miles personally. 5,000 soldiers, fewer than 40 people. Think about what that ratio tells you about the Apache's capacity to project fear far beyond their actual numbers. The Apache also demonstrated something that conventional military thinking struggles to counter. They were decentralized. There was no single command structure to behead, no capital city to capture, no supply line to cut. Each band operated with autonomy. You could defeat one group and it would have essentially zero strategic impact on the others. The Army was fighting a network, not a hierarchy, and they did not have the doctrine for it. It took the United States more than 25 years of sustained military effort, brutal, scorched earth campaigns, the forced relocation of entire populations, and ultimately a negotiated surrender to bring Apache resistance to an end. And even then, Geronimo negotiated terms. He was never truly conquered. He outlived the conflict and died of pneumonia in 1909 on a reservation in Oklahoma, still technically a prisoner of war. Now, before we get to the third and arguably most dominant force on the Southern Plains, I want to ask you something. Both the Lakota and the Apache resisted for decades, using completely different strategies. The Lakota used large-scale coalition warfare. The Apache used small-unit guerrilla tactics. If you had to choose one approach to defend your homeland against a technologically superior force, which would you pick? Think about it and drop your answer in the comments. The third nation, the Comanche. If the Lakota were the great coalition builders and the Apache were the masters of the Shadow War, the Comanche were something else entirely. They were the most dominant military force on the Southern Plains for over a century, and they achieved that dominance through a single transformative advantage: the horse. The Comanche were among the first native nations to acquire horses from Spanish settlements in the late 1600s. But unlike most groups who used horses primarily for transportation and hunting, the Comanche rebuilt their entire culture, their military doctrine, their economy, their social structure, around mounted warfare in a way no other nation on the continent matched. The name Comanche comes from a Ute word meaning anyone who wants to fight me all the time. Their neighbors coined that phrase. It tells you something. At their peak in the early 1800s, the Comanche controlled a territory roughly the size of France, a region historians now call Comancheria, spanning the southern plains from Kansas down into central Texas and into northern Mexico. They did not just occupy this territory, they dominated it. Other native nations avoided or negotiated with them. Spanish colonial settlements in Texas were effectively frozen in place for generations because Comanche raiding parties made expansion impossible. And Mexican settlements south of the Rio Grande faced the same reality. Their mounted archery was the most refined in North America. A Comanche warrior could ride at full gallop, drop below the neck of his horse to use the animal as a shield, and accurately fire arrows from underneath its neck at a rate that outpaced the reload time of any single-shot rifle of the era. In the time it took a soldier to fire one shot, reload with powder and ball, and take aim again, a skilled Comanche rider could deliver a dozen arrows with lethal accuracy while moving at 30 miles per hour. Early Texas settlers and Army units with single-shot muzzle loaders were at a catastrophic tactical disadvantage in open-field engagements. The Comanche also mastered something the Apache were known for as well: the hit and run. They would strike settlements, military posts, and supply trains with devastating speed, then scatter across terrain that cavalry pursuing them could barely navigate. By the time an organized response could be mounted, the raiding party had dissolved into the prairie. The Texas Rangers, arguably the most capable frontier fighting force the United States ever produced, were specifically created in response to Comanche raids, and even they struggled for decades. Full moon nights became something settlers and soldiers dreaded. Comanche warriors preferred to raid under bright moonlight, which gave them a visibility advantage over unprepared settlements and allowed rapid movement across terrain. The phrase Comanche moon became part of the Texas frontier vocabulary, a signal of fear and impending violence. Their last great military chief was Quanah Parker, a figure of extraordinary complexity. Born to a Comanche war leader father and a white captive mother named Cynthia Ann Parker, Quanah led the Quahati Band of the Comanche in their final years of open resistance. He commanded warriors in the Battle of Adobe Walls in 1874, where a Comanche-led force attacked a camp of professional buffalo hunters, fortified with long-range rifles. The attack ultimately failed to dislodge the hunters, but the strategic boldness of it, a direct assault on a fortified position by a numerically superior but conventionally outgunned force, demonstrated the Comanche capacity for large-scale tactical planning that went far beyond simple raiding. Quanah never surrendered in battle. He led his band onto the reservation in 1875, only when it became clear that the buffalo, the foundation of Comanche life, just as it was for the Lakota, had been systematically exterminated across the southern plains. The same strategy, the same weapon, not rifles. Ecology. Destroy the food system, and the people must follow. What followed was remarkable. Quanah Parker became one of the most influential Native American leaders of the early 20th century, negotiating with the federal government, managing reservation, land leasing, meeting with presidents. He built a bridge between two worlds without ever abandoning his Comanche identity. He died in 1911 and is buried today alongside his mother in Oklahoma. The Comanche legacy is not simply one of violence and resistance. It is one of absolute mastery of a way of life and a fighting style that held the most powerful military in North America at bay for over a century. When the United States finally pacified the southern plains in the mid-1870s, it did not do so by outfighting the Comanche. It did so by eliminating every reason the Comanche had to keep fighting. So here is the thought I want to leave you with. The Lakota Sioux, the Apache, the Comanche, three nations, three completely different strategies, one shared reality. They were not fighting to conquer, they were fighting to remain. And the fact that it took the United States Army decades of sustained effort, the deliberate destruction of entire ecosystems, forced relocation, massacre, and treaty violations to overcome them, is not a story of American triumph. It is a story of what happens when people who understand their land, who have spent generations learning how to live within it, and fight for it, decide that they have nothing left to lose. The battlefields are quiet now. The buffalo are slowly returning. And the names, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Cochise, Geronimo, Quanah Parker, are taught in history courses around the world. Not because they lost, but because of what it cost to make them stop. That is going to wrap it up for today on Frontier Uncensored. If this episode changed the way you think about the frontier era, drop a comment below and tell me which of these three nations you think was the most formidable military force and why. I read every single one. If you are watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. We go deep on the stories that shape this continent every single week. Until next time, keep asking the questions that matter.